welcome to Watercolours with Caroline. And the project this week is a waterfall that I photographed in Colorado Park here in Nanaimo. And I am just looking at my reference photo and blocking out the main shapes, simplifying the main shapes so that I can draw them on my watercolor paper. And it's important to do this because all the detail can get very confusing, and once you break it down into some big shapes, that can help you get down the very first sketch and start painting. And before I started painting, I used my masking fluid to mask out some of the highlights in the waterfall and on the trees, so that I could paint with a little bit more freedom and not worry about losing my whites. You can see the masking fluid is a little bit shiny, but it is perfectly dry. I'm starting that little bit of sky showing through with some Cerulean Blue, very, very light, but I wanted it a little cooler than the white of the waterfall. And it will look white when the painting's finished, but it will just push it into the background a little bit. Now I'm mixing up a light green. I like my green gold mixed with some cobalt blue, but if you don't have green gold, you can use something like an Aureolin or Azo Yellow or Winsor Yellow mixed with cobalt blue, or you could use a sap green. Any of your light green colors for your foreground ferns, which I'm putting, so just sort of blocking in. And then I'm putting some burnt sienna for the sort of bark mulch soil under the ferns. This is all my blocked in colours. I'm adding Ultramarine Blue and some Azo Yellow to darken up that light green. It's still a very light green. It will be a base colour for the forest at the back of the waterfall. And I just dipped into my Azo Yellow to have some variation in the green for the background trees. And I'm pushing, if you notice how I use my brush, I'm pushing down on the brush when I want to get a lot of that paint onto the paper quickly for my wash. And if I want small details like the trees in the background, I lift up my brush and use the point. And I'm putting in some burnt sienna down by the rocks at the bottom of the waterfall. And I will start now on the left hand side of the picture, putting in the same light greens. I will be doing some negative painting, some of it wet in wet and some of it dry, to give the impression, not realist, this is not photorealism, I'm not trying to get my photograph exactly. I'm doing an impression of the forest and the trees and the greenery behind the waterfall. And don't forget, this is an exercise. This is not what I would do for a finished painting. If I was doing a finished painting, this would be a preliminary sketch to help me figure out my values, my colors, my composition. And then if I did this as a bigger finished painting, I would spend a long time, hours, working on it very, very carefully, using this sketch and maybe others that I've done as a reference to help me not make any mistakes on my finished painting. Because as you know, with watercolor, it's very difficult to correct something once your paint is down. So I've mixed some Ultramarine Blue and I mixed Sepia and Azo Yellow and Alizarin Crimson, some burnt sienna all together to make what looks like a sort of a muddy brown on your palette. But actually, if you've got the yellow and the ultramarine in there and you put it on top of the wet light green, it will read absolutely as dark green evergreens. So I'm putting this in wet on wet, and that will give an impression of the very dark shadows behind the mostly fir trees that are on either side of this waterfall. I especially want to go very dark next to the waterfall because that will make the white water seem very bright and white. And one thing I looked at when I had finished this, assessing what I would change for a finished bigger painting, is that right hand side there where I have quite hard lines coming down the edge of the waterfall. If I was doing that again, I would wet that area and soften those lines so that I could get the splash and the misty effect of the waterfall on that side. And those are things that these small sketches help you figure out. And of course they are beautiful in themselves, a beautiful little finished small sketch. And the other thing is I find it very difficult to paint when there's a tripod there, so I'm not able to get as close and focus on the detail. The greenery in the background that I'm painting now is lighter than the foreground, so I've lightened up my colour a little bit, added some water, added a little bit of burnt sienna to warm it up, because it is out in the light much more than the shaded trees. And I kind of like that little glimpse of light and sky at the back of the waterfall. I'm adding a little bit of the darker green gold to my ferns, just to give me some shapes. When I come to the negative painting, I need some shapes to follow. Or alternatively, you could at this stage let the light green dry, and then you could use your masking fluid to mask out the ferns. I find you have to be really skilled with the masking fluid if you're using it for foreground details like that, because it can go on very splodgily and not as accurate as paint. And sometimes you're left with big shapes in the foreground that are not that accurate and not that pleasing. So I tend to avoid it most of the time. And like I'm doing here, using the point of my brush and careful painting to paint the trickles down the side of the waterfall, just with brush control. And most of the time I find brush control is better than masking fluid. But what I want is that very dark rock underneath the flowing water. So I'm going for a really dark greyish brown Ultramarine Sepia and Burnt Sienna. And I need to darken up those shadows at the side of the waterfall. And that's the thing with watercolours, and especially negative painting, is you work in layers. You start with your very lightest layers, and then you get darker and darker, making value judgments as you go along. And I need some very dark shadow up in that right corner, and coming down especially around the edge of the waterfall. If you look at the reference photo, very dark. I don't ever use black, not in watercolour. I find I love to mix the vibrant darks using sepia and burnt sienna, ultramarine blue, maybe Prussian blue, maybe phthalo blue. And if you put some alizarin crimson in there, that's a lovely dark transparent colour. You can mix warm darks and cool darks, huge variety of darks that are not just flat like a black would be. It gives your painting more colour and more interest. Now I'm going into my burnt sienna and my sepia, and I'm going to add a bit more definition to that front left corner behind the ferns. And I'm just using the very point of my number 4 brush to poke into where the fronds of the ferns would be. And if you're not sure about doing this, you can draw them very lightly with your pencil first if you want to give yourself some lines to follow. And if you look at the photograph, the center of the fern is dark too. It's dark under the fronds and in the center. And they need to have that direction of coming out from the center of the plant. And I'm adding some shadows to that, the soil and bark mulch under the fern. And I'm not being too fussy. Like I said, this is not photorealism. This is an impressionistic picture. If you look at my palette there too, notice how often I put colour into my palette and mix up a nice juicy mix of colours, so I've always got good strong colours to pick up on my brush. Don't use your paint until it's all completely dried up and gone, or your brush strokes won't be vibrant, they won't be dark. They'll be washed out and you'll keep trying to make your colour darker. You need to keep mixing paint and mixing water into your puddles of pigment so that you've always got a lovely amount of pigment to pick up on your brush. And if you have a good quality brush, it will hold a lot of pigment. That's the way the brush is supposed to work. It's supposed to have a lovely thin pointed tip so you can control your brush strokes, and it should have a big fat belly of the brush where it goes into the furrow that holds a lot of paint and water so you don't run out, so you can load up your brush, roll your brush in the paint, get it full of paint, and then it will gradually release itself down to the point of the brush, or it will release itself much more quickly if you push your brush down on the paper. And that is brush control. And it's very difficult to do if you don't have a good quality brush. The one I'm using is a silver black velvet. It's a mixture of squirrel, black squirrel hair and synthetic. It seems to be the perfect mix. And I know my number 8 brush, which I use all the time, I think I've had that thing for 20 years, maybe more. It was a gift given to me many years ago by some lovely students that I had. And I use it almost exclusively. And because I love that brand of brushes so much, I've bought many different sizes since then, but I still use my number 8, and it still has a beautiful point, lovely bristles on it. And it could be that one I'm using here, or it could be my number 4. I think it's the number 4 actually for these little details. And I mixed a sort of a pinky beige colour for the light shadows in the waterfall. I mixed that with raw sienna, cobalt blue, and a little touch of permanent rose. Quite warm, some of those shadows in the waterfall. And at the very end, I put a wash of cerulean blue on some of the waterfall to cool the temperature of the paint down a little bit. And this is sort of the fiddly stage where you're putting in the shadows, the splashes, and you're working on them slowly. And I've erased all of the masking fluids, and I've got some raw sienna cooled down a little bit with some cobalt blue, and I'm doing the trunk of the tree, which I have to say I did very poorly with the masking fluid. I think I was halfway between deciding to mask it and not mask it, and I decided maybe I'd just mask out the highlights on the tree, and I think it was a mistake. I should have either masked the whole thing or not at all. And I'm putting some cerulean blue on the branches on the right just to push them back a little bit. I'm very not happy with the tree on the left. It just didn't work out the way I should have done it. And those are all things that I decide when I've done a little sketch what I would change next time. I have done this waterfall before as a watercolour in my little sketchbook. So this is my second attempt at the same waterfall. And it's something I often avoid because I think waterfalls are very hard to do in watercolour because it involves so much negative painting. I'm just putting on a little bit of blue, ultramarine blue shadow to sort of unify everything. Sometimes your background, if it's too picky, it's not good. Thank you for watching.